Hi everyone, this is Mark Leverdew and welcome to my webinar on demand series. Today's webinar is entitled Match Coaching, and if you're interested in any of my other webinars on practice, on communication, on middle blocking, just the tip of the iceberg, check out markleverdew.com in the top right hand corner, webinars on demand. And with that, we'll get straight into it on match coaching. And match coaching, as I think about it, covers three main areas. Those three areas are the preparation, and preparation in this case means the pre-season or the week, for example, leading up to the match. Preparing to match coach, and how we go about as coaches choosing what our lineup is. That's for me an element of match coaching. We're also going to go through what we need to do directly before the match, choosing our starting rotation, choosing whether to serve and receive, and then in more detail about what we actually do during the course of the match in terms of statistics, timeouts, and substitutions, just as a quick little primer. Firstly, we're talking about our preparation. So what we do before match day to get ready for the match, both as coaches and for our team. And the first thing that really comes up for me is our observation position. And as we well know, the observation position for the coach during a match is on the sideline, but we also know that during practice, we tend to gravitate towards the baseline, as most coaches certainly feel that the best view of the game is from the baseline. Now, that may or may not be true. I don't necessarily agree with that 100% of the time. And in fact, if you go back to my communication skills webinar, then I talk quite a bit about what I feel like the best place to be in practice, and that is close to the middle of the court, which gives me the greatest chance to, and the greatest chance and the greatest possible effect of the communication with the team in terms of feedback and information during practice. So that's a different point, but what is important and undeniable is that we have to learn to understand the game from the match coaching position, so on the sideline. If you watch the games on TV and the Olympics or VNL or any of the big tournaments, you'll see coaches with earbuds or with tablets that have streaming of the game from the end court view, and the earbuds is a coach or a member of the staff that sits behind the court communicating with the head coach. But that is one way of doing it, and for me, I don't think all of it is completely necessary, and it's certainly not anything like the resources that most coaches have. So that makes it even more important that we learn to understand the game from the side of the court. In terms of the lineup, there's a lot of things that we think about as coaches that coaches have to do, but it's need to be clear that there are rules and there are tactics. And in terms of the lineup, there is only one rule, and that is 6 players on the court. Everything else is tactics, including how we organize the lineup. And what I mean by this is simple things like the libero doesn't have to play for the middle blocker in the back row. Now, it's a commonly held belief that that's the most efficient use of the libero, and coaches use their training to organize that in such a way, which means they don't coach the middle blocker to play volleyball. But there's no actual rule that says that middle blockers can't receive. If you have a middle blocker who receives, then just taking that player out because the rule says the libero has to play, that doesn't make much sense, and it's not the best use of your individual team's resources. Another example is having two outside hitters. You don't have to have two outside hitters. You can have three. If you have middle blockers who can receive, you only need one, and so on and so forth. What is key is to use the strengths that you have, and that means the individual players' strengths, and to hide their weaknesses. And the standard lineups that we have with two receivers and two middle blockers, etc., is really started, or in every case, it started with one coach who had, in the case of two receivers, he only had two receivers. So it made no sense for him to use five receivers just because in the past everybody used five receivers. And that's how those things work out. So if you have a different kind of group, then use the skills of that group and hide your weaknesses. In terms of building the lineup, the general guideline, and I think this is a fair guideline, is that it should be balanced in each rotation, so that each time you rotate to serve, the front row and the back row is more or less as strong as the previous lineup was. And of course, it's not possible to be exactly like that, but I think that's a pretty good starting point. There is an argument to be made for an unbalanced lineup, so to have 3 or 4 very strong rotations, for example, and perhaps 2 relatively very poor ones. And you can certainly manage the game in that way. And there's a pretty good argument, I think, that that's one way to maximize your potential. But I wouldn't really like to go into that without a fairly strong statistical or analytical backup to that. Some of the guidelines that we use for the 5-1 system. Now, I'm going to say that the 5-1 system has the outside hitter following the setter. That's the more common one, or the most common one, because there's only the more common one, because there's only 2 possibilities. But that's another example of, doesn't have to be like that, but let's just leave it at that for the moment. In choosing where to play the outside hitters, the commonly called outside hitter 1, there are a couple of different variations. One is the best receiver, and the reason for the best receiver is that outside hitter plays in position 6 twice, and the outside hitter that starts in the other position only plays in position 6 once. And position 6, of course, is the more important reception position and the one that's easiest for the opponent to serve at. So there's a good argument for the best receiver to be close to the setter. Another one is that it's the best attacker, because the best attacker is with this front row setter twice, and that's theoretically a weaker attacking rotation, or the weaker attacking rotations. If you have a left-handed outside that theoretically hits better from position 2, that's another one. Those are guidelines, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that one is more valid than any other one. It just depends how you want to go about making your choices. Which middle blocker should go close to the setter? We can say the best blocker because it's the best, because the setter is normally the weakest blocker. So you want to balance that lineup. Or you can say the best spiker should be there because the front row setter is the weakest attacking rotations. And you can kind of see that you can go around in circles with these things for a long time, which is why we're not going to spend a long time on them. Another one is that the setter in position 1 is normally the weakest rotation. So the best spiking middle should be in the front row when the setter's in position 1, which means away from the setter. That's another variation. The best server with the weakest block rotation. That's another way of looking at it. And we could go on and on. Libero defensive position is another one, whether they should play in 5 or 6 or even 1, which you can see rarely, but sometimes. And there are all arguments for and against all of these things. But as a coach, you need to make a decision about how you want to approach it. And that is what you do in the preparation leading up to game day. It can be useful to use statistics in choosing what your lineup is, statistics from previous matches. So you might go back and look at those statistics to decide which are the best rotations. And something that we're not going to get into at all today is the idea of the competitive cauldron, which is, in a nutshell, using competition at practice to decide who will be the starters for each match. And that's originated, I believe, from the North Carolina University soccer coach, Anson Dorrance, women's soccer coach. And that has a lot of supporters in terms of making practice good and, of course, giving yourself the best possible lineup that you can have. So that's what we do in the months and weeks before the game, month and week before the game. So we're up to directly before the match. And directly before the match, we want to look at our starting rotation, having the best rotations most often and the worst rotations the least often. That's the general way of looking at it. So that's why you will see as a standard, for example, the setter in position 2 when the team receives, or the setter in position 1 when the team serves, because the setter in the back row is the best blocking rotations. Another variation that you'll see really often is teams that automatically start with the setter in position 6, because the rotation setter in 1 is the worst rotation. So you go 1 past the worst rotation. One thing that I haven't noted here, but a lot of coaches will look at individual matchups, blocking matchups or serving matchups, how to attack with your serve different opponent lineups, or how to nullify strong lineups from the opponent, either serving or attacking. So those are some of the considerations we can have. It's worth noting that strong siding out rotations are not the same as strong serving rotations. And P1 is a really good example. What you can often find is that because setters really often good servers, not just good in terms of power, but tactically good, it's a really common outcome that when the setter serves, it's a really good point scoring rotation, but it's also one of the worst side out rotation. So there's a balance that you can also search for there. And one other thing that we can think about is just starting with our best spiker in position 4 or our best server serving and go through like that. We can get as complicated as we want, but sometimes it's just as good to be simple. The eternal question, whether to serve or receive. Before we answer that, we have to ask the question, where is our advantage? And simply, our advantage lies in the game phase that you have a greater than 50% success ratio. So that's the first thing, is that you have to know what the balance is between serving rotations and reception rotations. Are you better? Which one are you better in? Most of the time, the answer is side out rotations. So in high performance, the receiving team wins between 60 and 75% of the points. And so it's pretty clear that that is the place to start. So that's men's and women's. As you go down the level, or as you go down to your level, what's important is that you know what your own numbers are. So there are lots of things lots of times where you should watch TV and see what the best do. And there are other times when you should ignore what the best do and dig down to find out what the answer is for your league. And that's an exercise that you should always do as a coach, is to understand what your league is and what are your standards, which we're going to come to again in about 2 minutes' time. So that's all of the stuff that we need to have before the match. So we're practice watching the match from the correct angle, how we organize our lineup, all the different possibilities there, whether we serve or receive. And now the referee has blown the whistle and we come up to the match. First thing that we can talk about here is statistics and the use of statistics during the match. I'm not going to go into really big details, but we'll go through a few simple things and a few simple ideas. Statistics, firstly, they help to make good decisions. And when I mean good, what I really mean is emotion-free decisions. Emotions, and we can, there's a lot of evidence like this, about this in different fields, in fields of behavioral economics, in fields of psychology, how our emotions can lie to us basically. And the great advantage of statistics is that they can take emotions out of, to at least to a degree, they can take emotions out of decisions. And that helps, firstly, to make better decisions, but also to explain those decisions after the fact. So statistics, important for making good emotion-free decisions. And those statistics can be very simple. It doesn't need to be a big, expensive software or app, or using a tablet, or using whatever. It can be very simple pen and paper stuff by an assistant coach, by subs, even by parents. So using the substitutes to keep some simple statistics is really valuable for a few different ways, a few different reasons. It keeps players involved with the game off the court. It adds to the sense of involvement of all players in the process. And what's really important is that it helps players to understand the game and also understand what coaches are doing during the game, and then they can give feedback to each other, which is also really valuable. Parents obviously can also be co-opted, requested, asked to give some help during practice or during games as well, for some really simple stuff. And the simple things can be just points won and lost in attack, serving, and so on. They can be very complex, or at least more complex. And the things that I look at during the game, and these are the main two numbers that I follow during a match, our side out and breakpoint percentages. So how often we win points on our reception, how often we win points on our serve. And for me, that's the most basic way to look at the game and to break through some of the emotions of it. I've told this story many times, so you can click through 30 seconds if you've heard it already. But one of the things I found is that, especially when a team is behind or they don't feel like they're playing well, there's a real tendency to focus on block and defense as being the area that needs to improve. Now, in a sense, if you're behind, that's true, because you need to win points on the serve to catch up. But what isn't helpful is to focus on that when the actual reason that you're behind is something different. So I use the side out and breakpoint standards, and that's an important point we have to come back to understand if it's my side out that's causing me problems or my breakpoint. And what's really important is for you to know not just the standards of your team, but also, as much as possible, the standards within your league. After I understand which phase of the game might be causing us some difficulties, then I'll look at individual breakdowns. And by individual breakdowns, I mean in terms of firstly skill, and secondly individuals. So if I identify that siding out is causing us problem, our side out is below our normal standards, then I will look at our reception quality, our attack quality, and perhaps opponent blocks against our attack. And from there, I'll get some more detail about what we can improve. And the same with breakpoint. So I'll look at the opponent reception quality, I'll look at the opponent attack quality, and then I can make a judgment, a much better judgment on whether it's our defense that's causing us trouble, or whether it's our block or our serve or something in between. And then the individual breakdowns of players. So then I can look at individual players, which players are performing below their standards. And that can be something that comes up when we want to make potential substitutions later down the line. Next, we come to the very interesting discussion about momentum. And of course, does it exist? For the purpose of this webinar, we are going to make the assumption that it does exist. And I think that we're going to make the statement that momentum exists because people think that it exists. Volleyball is a series of unconnected, or at least physically unconnected events, but they are connected in the psychological sense that of what happened just before, what's about to happen, or what people's expectations of what's happening will be. And so I'm going to make the statement that momentum exists because most people think that it does, and therefore coaches' actions are useful to manipulate momentum. If you disagree with the previous statement, then probably you haven't, well, probably you're not watching this at all, but almost certainly you'll disagree with some things that come after this, but that's fine too. We can have a discussion on any of the social media platforms that you can find me on. I look forward to having that discussion. So the first thing that we talk about during the match is timeouts. And timeouts are one of my favorite topics. If you go to Mark Lebedew marklebedew.com and type timeouts in the search box, at the last time I checked, it's well over 50 articles on timeouts, some semi-scientific research projects, some general concepts and ideas, a lot of them with the outcome that timeouts do not work. And what has been found over and over again is that if you measure the likelihood of winning a rally after a timeout with the likelihood of winning a random rally at any time during the match, that there is no difference between the chance of winning any rally and the chance of winning a rally after a timeout. And that is the evidence that timeouts do not work. Now, there's some people who like to talk about the few points after a timeout. That's yes, there are points. If you look at the 4 points after a timeout and before a timeout, the 4 points after a timeout are always more successful than the 4 points before. But that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're choosing a period of a match where you lose more points than normal, which is by definition what happens before a timeout, then you would, and you compare that to the 4 rallies at any other time of a match, then it is self-fulfilling that worse periods are worse than better periods. So that's a couple of the dead ends I think that we get into. But for me, and this is the first time that I will have revealed what I really think about timeouts, is the key to all of this stuff is on average. So on average, timeouts don't seem to have any effect on the outcome of a rally, and that is not debatable, because we've proven that time and time again in different leagues and different years and so on and so forth. But one explanation of this, of course, is that some people are better than others. So we talk about the average of spiking being 46% or 47% or whatever it is in your league, but that doesn't mean every spiker spikes at 47%. Some people are better, some players are better, and some players are worse. And I think that is a pretty good way of thinking about timeouts as a coach. Taking timeouts is a skill. Identifying the moment, particularly identifying the moment to take a timeout, is a skill and it is something that you can improve. And if we have done a few simpler studies on individual coaches, and one of the things that we found is that some coaches are better than others. Better teams are generally better after timeouts than worse teams, but there are examples of coaches, individual coaches, who are much better than they should be with all of the averages involved. So we can make then the assertion or proposition that coach calling a timeout is a skill and something that you can get better at. And we'll talk about reflection later on, but a key thing for me was the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And basically it's about how we make decisions, and the blink here refers to the blink of an eye. And one of the underlying theses of the book is that there are some decisions that are better made unconsciously, and there are some decisions that are better made with full information. The perfect example is, or the great example that they come up with in the book is that when you buy a house, it's a much better purchase to be made emotionally, because a house is something that you're going to spend a long time in. Every day when you walk into the house, if you don't like it, it's going to be something that makes you feel bad over a long period of time. And whatever the economic outcome of it is, of buying that house in the first place, you will feel bad every time you went in. But a purchase at a supermarket, the last minute purchases, I forget what they're called right now, at the checkout, it's better to think about the price of those and to save 1 or 2 cents, because the pleasure that you get from that is all similar, and it's better to make that decision purely on financial outcomes rather than emotional outcomes. And for me, the timeouts are one of those things that you should follow, or you could get better outcomes by using your emotions to decide when to take a timeout. And that's something that I've personally done better and worse at different times. And I really went through one period in particular where I focused on my emotions and my feeling of when to take a timeout, rather than the empirical fact that I knew they didn't work. And I felt that they were much better and more successful. Now, there's no samples, there's certainly not a big enough sample size, and I can't empirically prove any of that. But that is that's what I really think about timeouts, if anybody was wondering all of this time. When should you take a timeout? There are some, obviously, I've just given one really good example, is when you emotionally feel that you should. There are many very famous, very successful coaches who have very fixed timeout patterns. And one particular coach I know who's coaches one of the top national teams in the world, he will always call a timeout after he loses 3 points in a row. And it doesn't matter if the score is 0-3 or 20-21 or 24-14. If he loses 3 points in a row, he will always call a timeout. I think that's probably, or perhaps, a good starting point, but I don't think any coach needs to call a timeout at 24-14, which he once did against me. You can call a timeout or could call a timeout when a particular server was going back to serve. There is some servers are more likely to make an error after a timeout. Another one of the great timeout myths is that there are more service errors after timeouts. There are actually, on average, fewer service errors after timeouts. And you can go to marklebergy.com to find out all of that and do a search, and you'll get all of that data. But of course, averages are not individuals, and there are some servers who make more errors and some servers who make less. And if you can research which servers make more errors after timeouts, that can be a useful thing to know. One of my rules is a good time to call a timeout is after a long rally, and after a long rally that you've lost in particular. After a long rally, particularly one that's where the players are puffing and panting, and that's when errors are more likely to occur, or there's particularly errors of lack of focus and concentration. So the serving team has a really big advantage there by just putting the ball into play, more or less, and there's more chance for the side-out team to make an unforced error that they wouldn't normally make. And so that's one of my particular rules, is to call a timeout after those rallies to make sure that the players have an extra breather and have that time to refocus. Against the best server is another time to call timeouts. Whether or not that server makes more or less errors after timeouts is probably something that you should know as well. And the beginning and end of sets is a really interesting, is also a really interesting point. So we tend to think of points later in the set as being more valuable. The point at 23-24, of course, is much more valuable than the point at 0-1, because 1 is the end of is potentially the end of a set, and 1 is definitely not. So there is some validity to the idea of saving your timeouts to the end of the set. But one of the things in one of the research projects that we did is that points at the beginning of the set actually can be very, very valuable. And that's particularly the points where you might go from a 2 to a 3 point deficit, or a 3 to a 4 point deficit early in the set. And we found that it's actually difficult to come back, or unlikely to come back, from a 2-5 or a 1-5 or a 2-6 deficit. And you're much better off calling a timeout at, say, 1-4 to make sure that you don't get that 4 point deficit, than holding out until the end of the set when you might be 14-23 and the timeout really has no purpose other than to annoy everybody, including the spectators. What do we talk about in timeouts? Now, the first thing that we should talk about in this context, and not what we should talk about during a match, during a timeout, is what just happened. And it's the most common, let's say, mistake that coaches make in timeouts, is to call the players in and tell them, spend 15 seconds telling them exactly what happened in the last 5 points or 10 points or whatever the case may be. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. Firstly, it's dwelling on stuff that has is in the past. And secondly, the players who played know exactly what happened in that period of time. They don't need to be reminded of it. What they need is advice to fix whatever the problem is that, or the hole it is they've just dug for themselves. So please, no commentary. What we need to have during the timeout is information, and information that's tactical information about how to improve our situation, whatever that may be, side out, break point, individual tactics, so on and so forth. There is also a balance between how much we talk to individuals and how much we talk to the team. Basically, people, players aren't able in that short period of time to process a large amount of information. So to talk for full 30 seconds non-stop, you can be fairly certain that the team won't listen, for one thing, but won't really be able to process and use all of that information. So it's better to say 1 or 2 points to the team as a whole, and then perhaps to take out an individual if it's required, and talk to them one-on-one. Another thing is for an assistant or assistants to talk to individuals while the coach talks to the team, or vice versa. I should have prefaced this, of course, by saying that I watch a lot of TV, and I watch a lot of volleyball on TV, and I'm always intrigued by the timeouts that coaches take, and they are very commonly poor if you follow the exact principles of timeouts. And I'm absolutely not excluding myself from that. I know that my timeouts are just as bad as everybody else's. I hope that they're a tiny bit better, or at least if I have a bad one, I come back and the next time and have a good one. But you'll often see that coaches do things that are not good timeouts. Let's leave it at that. In the communication skills webinar that you can also find at markleverdew.com, webinars on demand, we talk in a lot more detail about the contents, or the way to communicate in timeouts and in general. And these are the important things to consider. The first one is the tone. The tone conveys the emotion that you want to put across. So if you want the team to be calm, you can't shout. If you want the team to be emotional, you can't talk softly. So the tone conveys the emotion, and the words contain the content. So the two things have to be consistent. Body language is really important. Jumping up and down, turning red, spitting, waving your arms up and down, turning your back to the team. All of those things have outcomes that are perhaps not the intention of the coach, but are equally, or in some cases more important. The orientation of the group is really vital. You'll see a lot of timeouts with players looking in different directions, some sitting, some standing, which is perfectly fine unless the coach is trying to talk to everybody at the same time, And if that is the case, then the coach needs to make sure that the orientation of him or her with the players is appropriate. Instructions to a minimum. We already talked about that. You can give directions. So what we talked about in the communication skills webinar was that directions were not appropriate to give players in the learning phase of anything, of any skill or tactic. That it is appropriate to ask questions, to promote reflection in order to cause learning. The difference with a match is that a match has a performance outcome right now, and directions can be effective, often are effective in the short term. So when performance is our goal, then directions are appropriate. When learning is our goal, directions are not appropriate. And the visuals, of course, the whiteboard that we commonly see coaches have and use. So that's a fair bit on timeouts, which is the main thing that the main way as coaches we can influence the game. The second, influence a match rather after it started. The second one is substitutions, and I have there are a few guidelines for using substitutions. The first one is to improve a weakness, and that is the most obvious one. If somebody is receiving poorly, you put in a better receiver. If somebody's spiking poorly, and so on and so forth. A really common substitution is the double sub, the setter and the opposite substitution. A lot of top teams use that. So if you watch a tournament like Volleyball Nations League, where there are 32 men's and women's teams, probably 20 of those use the double sub as a standard operating procedure. The setter comes in for the opposite in the back row, the opposite comes in for the setter in the front row, and that has the effect of strengthening the offense and block, and also of affecting the blocking rhythm and tactics of the opponent. You can use specialists, so specialist receiver, specialist blocker, specialist server, who each of whom come on for one or more rotations. You can use substitutions to affect the emotional level of the team. So you might have a spark plug player, if you want to describe it in that way, somebody who can come on and change the emotional level of the team. That can have a really positive outcome, and something I used, especially in juniors, but also used it actually in some really big matches. And team building is another way to use substitutions, and perhaps team building is not the exact description that I'm looking for. Perhaps it's more something like team unity, sense of purpose. When more people are involved in the active part of playing, so in the match, that can have a really powerful, positive impact on the group, on the team unity. So sometimes taking a player in, or taking a player out and putting a player in, has a purpose, has an effect beyond one individual match. Hopefully you would win the first match, but sometimes there can be a long-term team building effect in making particular substitutions at particular times. So we did come back to the term team building. You can also use timeouts, substitutions as a quasi timeout. So I played a lot against one particular coach who would rotate his middles at important moments of the set when he didn't want to take a timeout. The basic idea being that his middles were of a similar level to each other, and it was a way to break the play, and also likely had some team building effect as well when the middles are all ready to play and ready to go in to change the game. But for him, the basic reason or the underlying reason was a quasi timeout. During the match, we also have the ability to give instructions to players. So we're standing on the sideline, very close to the match. We can talk to them at any time, not only between rallies, but during the rallies. But you don't have to. That's one thing to remember. Just because you're allowed to do something doesn't mean you have to do it. And my general philosophical response to this is to let the players play. They're much better at playing when they have some freedom. The practice time is when you teach them how to play, and in the game, except for specific tactical solutions to game problems, most of the time, the best solution is to let them play. And I would say, especially for juniors, let them play, let them make mistakes, let them learn about the game, and use the practice time to teach them how to play, to teach them how to make decisions, to teach them how to find solutions. And in the game, let them put practice into play and let them learn from their own activities, their own mistakes. This is one really crucial thing for me, is that as a coach, we have a really strong feeling, a really strong expectation that we have to do something. We're not able to play the game. The cultural expectation of the coach is that they are the puppet masters. And so we have this constant fight within ourselves that we have to do something to prove ourselves, to prove our worth, to control the game. And this is, for me, this is what should be avoided at all costs. And basically, it comes down to this, for me, that you don't have to do anything or something. You have to do the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is to do nothing. That's all. After the match, we have to reflect on what we did during the match. And reflection, as we learn from Communication Skills webinar, is what is required for learning, and even for coaches. We know that the story of the game is written after it's over. Nobody really knows what happens during the game. Nobody can really predict what's going to happen before it started. And basically, we experience the game And then afterwards, we tell a story about what it is that just happened. So this happened because of this and this and this, and that's why we won or lost or whatever the situation is. That's not how it really happened, because nobody knows what would have happened if something else happened instead. So what we have to do as coaches is when we reflect, is to reflect on how we made the decisions at the time, and not what was the effect of the decisions that we made. And if it can be that we made decisions because we incorrectly assessed the information that we have at hand, it can be that the decisions were poor because we ignored some fact, we let emotions take over, or not, because we know, because we already talked about how emotions can be positive. And it can also be that you made all of the correct decisions, but you lost the game anyway. And that is, if that's the case, you certainly won't get any feedback from other people that, you know what, you coached a fantastic game today. Every decision was perfect. When you left that player in, it was the perfect decision because now they're going to have confidence for the rest of the season. And great game, even though you lost. You will never, ever get that feedback. So firstly, don't expect it. And when you make your reflection, judge how you made the decisions at the time and not how they worked at the end, and especially what the result of the game was. You can have terrible games that you lost, that you won, and great games that you lost. So that is my advice on how to reflect after the match on your match day work. With that, we come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you for your attention. I hope that you got some stuff out of it. By all means, make contact with me on any of the social media platforms that you can find me on. If you enjoyed it and haven't seen any of the other webinars, then the place to go is markleverdew.com, webinars on demand. And some of the ones that you will find, some on practice, some stuff about middle blockers. That second one should be middle blockers attacking. It's different from middle blockers blocking. Communication skills, which we've referred to a few times through here, and welcome to my gym is a virtual tour of my gym with explanations of how and why I do use the drills that I do. And with that, thank you again. It has been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again soon.